The bitter wind howled across the Montana plains, carrying with it the promise of a storm that would be remembered for generations to come. Preston Quinn stared out the window of his isolated cabin, watching as the first heavy snowflakes began to fall against a darkening December sky. The year was 1877, and winter had arrived with a vengeance that matched the hollow ache in his chest. Preston ran a calloused hand through his unkempt dark hair, now streaked with premature gray at just 32 years of age. 3 months had passed since he'd buried his wife Sarah beneath the old oak tree that stood sentinel over their modest cattle ranch. 3 months of talking to ghosts and waking to cold sheets where warmth once lay. The consumption had taken her quickly. Too quickly for the doctor from Silverstone, the nearest town some 15 miles away, to offer anything but sympathetic words and morphine to ease her passing. Now, as the first major snowstorm of the season descended, Preston found himself utterly alone with nothing but a dwindling woodpile, half a bottle of whiskey, and memories that cut deeper than the winter chill. He hadn't been to town since the funeral. Hadn't seen a living soul apart from his own reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin, a reflection he hardly recognized anymore. The ranch hands he'd employed during summer had moved on before the first frost, seeking work elsewhere for the winter months as was customary. His cattle had been sold off, all except for a few head and his faithful horse Thunder, sheltered in the barn alongside the milk cow. The wind intensified, rattling the windows of the cabin that suddenly seemed too large, too empty. Preston turned away from the glass and stoked the dying fire, tossing another log onto the flames. Sarah would have scolded him for letting it burn so low. Sarah would have had stew simmering on the stove, the scent of fresh bread filling the air instead of dust and despair. "Damn it all," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. He reached for the whiskey bottle, contemplating whether tonight would be the night he finally emptied it, when a sound cut through the howl of the wind, a sound so unexpected that at first he thought he'd imagined it. A knock at the door. Preston froze, the bottle halfway to his lips. Nobody in their right mind would be out in this weather, especially not to call upon a man who'd made it clear he wanted no company. He set the whiskey down and reached for his Winchester rifle that leaned against the wall, approaching the door with caution born of frontier wariness. "Who's there?" he called out, his finger resting near the trigger. "Please," came a woman's voice, barely audible above the wind. "I'm lost in the storm. I saw your light." Preston hesitated, then unbolted the door, pulling it open just enough to peer out. The wind immediately forced it wider, and there on his porch stood a woman clutching a covered pot to her chest, her face partially obscured by a snow-dusted hood. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir," she said, her teeth chattering. "I was delivering soup to the Wilkinsons. They're down with fever, but my wagon wheel broke, and I lost my bearings in the snow." Preston stood dumbfounded for a moment. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and this woman had been traveling alone. "The Wilkinsons live 7 miles east," he said gruffly. "I know that now," she replied with a hint of wry humor despite her obvious distress. "I'm from Silverstone. I'm new to the area." I clearly underestimated the distance and the weather. A particularly violent gust nearly knocked her off her feet, and Preston's ingrained sense of decency finally overcame his desire for solitude. He pulled the door fully open. "Come in before you freeze to death," he said, stepping aside. The woman hurried past him, bringing with her the scent of something rich and savory that made Preston's stomach clench in sudden hunger. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd eaten a proper meal. She lowered her hood, revealing a face that struck Preston with its quiet determination rather than conventional beauty. Honey-brown hair escaped from a practical bun, framing features reddened by the cold. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with clear blue eyes that assessed him with equal parts gratitude and wariness. "Thank you," she said, still clutching the pot. "I'm Delia Morgan. I've only been in Silverstone 3 months. I work at the general store, but I also help Dr. Frederick sometimes with his patients." Preston shut the door against the storm, setting his rifle aside but keeping his distance. "Preston Quinn," he responded after an awkward pause. "This is my ranch, Quinn Ranch," she nodded. "I've heard of it. I'm truly sorry to impose." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the howling wind. Preston realized he was staring and cleared his throat. "You can. Set that down," he gestured to the pot she still held. "And take off your coat. Fire's going." Delia placed the pot on the table and removed her wet outer garments. Beneath her heavy coat, she wore a simple brown dress, practical rather than fashionable, with a white apron now stained from her journey. "I don't suppose the Wilkinsons will be getting their soup tonight," Preston said, attempting a gruff form of humor that felt foreign on his tongue. "I doubt they'd want it frozen solid," she replied with a small smile. "But perhaps you might benefit from it instead. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in some time, if you don't mind my saying so." Preston should have been offended by her forthright assessment, but the rumble in his stomach betrayed him. "I get by," he said defensively. "Of course," she nodded, not pushing the matter. "Still, it would be a shame to waste good chicken soup. Would you mind if I heated it? It's the least I can do for your hospitality." Preston gestured toward the cast iron stove. "Help yourself." He watched as Delia moved about his kitchen with surprising efficiency, finding a ladle and bowls without having to ask where anything was kept. There was something both unsettling and comforting about having a woman in the house again, bringing life to spaces that had grown still and cold. "Your storm's not letting up," she observed, glancing toward the windows where snow now completely obscured the view. "I don't suppose there's any chance of me making it back to town tonight." Preston followed her gaze. The realization that this stranger, this woman, would need to stay the night in his home struck him with sudden force. It was the proper thing to offer, yet the thought of anyone occupying the space that had been Sarah's filled him with irrational resentment. "You can take the bedroom," he said stiffly. "I'll sleep out here." Delia turned to him, a flash of relief crossing her features before her expression grew concerned. "I couldn't put you out of your own bed, Mr. Quinn. You're not." "I haven't slept there in months," he admitted before he could stop himself. Understanding dawned in her eyes, and Preston braced himself for the pity that inevitably followed when people learned of his situation. But Delia simply nodded and returned her attention to the soup, giving him the dignity of privacy with his grief. "The soup will be hot soon," she said. "And then perhaps you could tell me about your ranch. I find it helps pass the time during storms." Preston doubted he would have much to say, but as the savory aroma filled the cabin, he found himself pulling out a chair at the table that had gone unused for too long. The soup was indeed good, rich with chunks of chicken, carrots, and herbs that Preston couldn't name but appreciated nonetheless. He couldn't remember the last time food had tasted like anything but ash in his mouth, yet he found himself accepting a second bowl when Delia offered it. "My mother's recipe," she explained when he commented on its quality. "She always said a good soup could cure most anything." "Not everything," Preston replied, the brief moment of normality shattered by reality. Delia met his gaze steadily. "No," she agreed softly. "Not everything." She didn't press him for details, and he offered none. Instead, she spoke of Silverstone, of her journey west from Philadelphia after her father's passing, of the general store where she worked for old Mr. Abernathy, who was gradually turning more responsibility over to her as his eyesight failed. "You came west alone?" Preston found himself asking, curious despite himself. "That's unusual for a woman." "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but necessity often drives us to unusual paths. My father left debts and there was nothing for me in Philadelphia. My cousin Martha married a man from Montana Territory, and she wrote of opportunities here." A shadow crossed her face. "Unfortunately, by the time I arrived, Martha and her husband had moved on to Oregon, but Mr. Abernathy needed help and doctor. Frederick said I had a knack for tending the sick, so I stayed." The simple resilience in her story stirred something in Preston: respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred determination to forge ahead despite circumstances. As the evening wore on, the storm intensified. The wind found every crack in the cabin's walls, sending drafts that made the lamp flames dance. Preston added more wood to the fire and found himself continuing their conversation, sharing bits and pieces of ranch life, the challenges of the cattle business, the satisfaction of working land that was his own, the plans he'd had for expansion come spring. He carefully avoided any mention of Sarah, speaking as though the ranch had always been his alone, but Delia was observant. Her eyes occasionally drifted to the woman's shawl still hanging on a peg by the door, the pair of small boots tucked neatly beneath a chair, the sewing basket beside the rocking chair that hadn't been touched in months. When the soup was gone and the hour grew late, Preston showed Delia to the bedroom, feeling like an intruder in a space that had once been intimately his own. He quickly gathered a change of clothing and retreated, leaving her to privacy. "Thank you, Mr. Quinn," she said before he closed the door. "Not everyone would have opened their door to a stranger in a storm." "Anyone would have," he responded gruffly. "No," she said with a certainty that gave him pause. "Not everyone would. Good night." Preston made up a makeshift bed on the floor near the fireplace, using blankets from the trunk where Sarah had stored extra bedding. He expected sleep to elude him as it often did, but the combination of a full stomach, the hypnotic sound of the storm, and the strange comfort of another human presence in the house lulled him into the deepest sleep he'd had in months. He awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. For a disorienting moment, he thought Sarah had returned, that the past months had been nothing but a terrible dream. Then reality reasserted itself, and he remembered his unexpected guest. Delia stood at the stove, her back to him, her hair freshly pinned up. She'd managed to find the coffee and get a morning fire going without waking him. Outside, the world was eerily silent, the storm having blown itself out during the night. "Good morning," she said, turning as he sat up. "I hope you don't mind. I found the coffee and thought I'd make breakfast. There were some eggs still good in your cold box." Preston ran a hand through his hair, acutely aware of his rumpled appearance and the stubble on his jaw. "You didn't need to do that." "Consider it further payment for shelter," she replied easily. "Besides, I was hungry, and it seemed impolite to cook just for myself." The coffee was strong and hot, exactly how he preferred it. The eggs were seasoned with herbs she'd found in Sarah's carefully organized pantry, and there was even bacon that Preston had forgotten he had. They ate in surprisingly comfortable silence, watching through the windows as the sun transformed the harsh landscape into a blinding expanse of white. "It's beautiful," Delia observed, "when you're safely inside looking out." Preston nodded. "Dangerous beauty. That's a good 3 feet of snow out there." The implication hung between them. There would be no traveling to town today or likely for several days. The roads would be impassable until they were cleared or the snow compacted enough for sleighs. "I should check the animals," Preston said, rising from the table. Make sure the barn roof held under the weight. I'll clean up here, Delia offered, and perhaps take inventory of your supplies. If I'm to be an unexpected guest for a few days, I should at least make myself useful. Preston wanted to protest this woman taking stock of his household felt too intimate, too much like someone trying to fill Sarah's role, but practicality won out. His pantry was likely in poor shape, and he hadn't been paying proper attention to such details. Do what you need to, he said shortly, reaching for his heavy coat and gloves. The bitter cold took his breath away as he stepped outside. The snow reached halfway up his thighs, and he had to force his way through the drifts to reach the barn. Inside, he found the animals restless but unharmed. The barn roof had indeed held, though a small drift had formed inside where snow had blown through a gap in the boards. Preston set about his chores with methodical precision, feeding and watering the livestock, checking for any signs of illness or injury, reinforcing the weak spot in the roof. Physical labor felt good, grounding him in the present moment rather than the past or the uncertain future that now included a house guest for an indeterminate time. When he returned to the cabin, stomping snow from his boots, he found the place transformed. The breakfast dishes had been washed and put away, the floor swept, and a stew was already simmering on the stove, filling the air with a rich aroma that made his mouth water despite the hearty breakfast he'd eaten earlier. Delia sat at the table, a piece of paper before her covered in neat handwriting. She looked up as he entered, her expression businesslike. "Your supplies are adequate but not ideal," she informed him without preamble. "You have enough flour, sugar, and coffee to last a while, and there's a good amount of preserved meat in the root cellar. But you're low on fresh vegetables, just a few potatoes and onions left, and you're completely out of salt and baking soda." Preston hung his coat by the door, oddly defensive at her assessment. "I've been meaning to get to town." "Of course," she nodded, not challenging his obvious lie. "I've made a list of what you might consider stocking up on when the road's clear. I hope that's not overstepping." It was overstepping, and they both knew it, but Preston found he didn't mind as much as he should have. There was something refreshing about her practical approach, free from the pitying looks he'd grown to despise. "The animals all right?" she asked, changing the subject. "They're fine." "Barn solid. We got lucky with this one." "We did," she agreed. "Though I imagine Mr. and Mrs. Wilkinson are wondering what happened to their soup delivery." The unexpected touch of humor caught Preston off guard, and a rusty chuckle escaped before he could suppress it. "I reckon, Doctor. Fredericks might be wondering what happened to his assistant, too." "Oh, he'll figure I've holed up somewhere safe," she assured him. "He's a practical man. And thankfully, the Wilkinsons' fever isn't dangerous, just the winter ague. They'll manage without my soup." The day passed in a rhythm that felt both strange and oddly natural. While Preston tended to outdoor chores, clearing paths to the necessary buildings and checking fence lines where he could reach them, Delia maintained the domestic sphere with quiet efficiency. She seemed to intuit when to engage him in conversation, and when to allow silence, a skill that even Sarah had sometimes lacked in their early years together. By evening, Preston found himself talking more than he had in months, sharing stories of his journey west from New York as a young man of 20, how he'd worked cattle drives and saved every penny until he could purchase this land 7 years ago. He omitted how he'd met Sarah during those cattle drive years, how she'd been the cook's daughter at a way station in Kansas, how they'd corresponded for 2 years before he'd saved enough to send for her. Delia, in turn, spoke of Philadelphia, of her father's small publishing business that had failed when larger companies undercut his prices, of her work as a schoolteacher before coming west. She had a way of telling stories that made them come alive, the children she'd taught, the characters she'd encountered on her journey west, the eccentric residents of Silverstone who were gradually accepting her as one of their own. Except for Mrs. Harrington, she added with a grimace. She's convinced I have designs on her son Elliot, despite the fact that he's barely 20 and still writes his name backward half the time. Preston found himself smiling again, the expression feeling foreign on his face. Elliot Harrington wouldn't know what to do with a woman like you anyway. As soon as the words left his mouth, he felt a flash of discomfort. It had been an oddly personal remark, bordering on improper. But Delia merely raised an eyebrow, her lips quirking upward. "I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Quinn." "Preston," he corrected, surprising himself again. "Seems foolish to stand on formality when you're cooking in my kitchen." "Preston, then," she nodded. "And I'm Delia, not Miss Morgan." That night, Preston again insisted she take the bedroom while he slept by the fire. The arrangement continued for 3 more days, as the snow gradually settled, and the temperatures remained too cold for significant melting. Each day followed a similar pattern: shared breakfast, separate tasks during daylight hours, then evening meals and conversation that gradually grew more comfortable. On the 4th day, Preston noticed Delia standing at the window, gazing toward town with a pensive expression. "The road should be passable tomorrow," he said, correctly interpreting her thoughts, "if the weather holds." She turned, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, I imagine so. Mr. Abernathy will be wondering where I've disappeared to. And you'll be glad to have your home to yourself again." Preston wanted to contradict her, but found the words stuck in his throat. The truth was, he wasn't eager for her to leave. The cabin had begun to feel like a home again rather than a mausoleum of memories. There was warmth and purpose in each room that had been absent for months. "You've been good company," he managed finally. "As have you," she replied. "Though I imagine the circumstances were hardly what you would have chosen." That evening, their conversation felt strained for the first time, both aware that their unusual arrangement was coming to an end. Preston found himself stealing glances at Delia as she mended a tear in her dress by lamplight, noting the way her fingers moved deftly with needle and thread, the slight furrow of concentration between her brows. "What will you tell people in town?" he asked suddenly. "About staying here?" Delia looked up, her expression serious. "The truth, that my wagon broke down, you offered shelter during the storm, and you were a perfect gentleman throughout. Why, are you concerned about gossip?" Preston shrugged uncomfortably. "Towns like Silverstone run on gossip. Wouldn't want your reputation damaged." "My reputation," Delia said with a hint of amusement, "is already that of an independent woman who came west alone and works for both the general store and the doctor. People already find plenty to whisper about without adding imagined impropriety." She set her mending aside and fixed him with a direct gaze. "But if you're concerned about your own standing, I understand. Men have different considerations." "I don't give a damn what people think of me," Preston replied honestly. "Haven't for a long time, since your wife died." She asked gently. The direct reference to Sarah hit him like a physical blow. He'd carefully avoided any mention of her, and Delia had respected that unspoken boundary until now. "Yes," he said after a long pause. "Since Sarah." Delia waited, giving him space to say more or nothing at all. The choice was entirely his. "It was consumption," he continued, the words coming slowly at first, then faster. "Quick-moving kind. She was fine in July, coughing in August, gone by September. Doctor couldn't do anything. Nobody could." "I'm sorry," Delia said simply. "How long were you married?" 6 years, Preston answered, a lifetime of memories compressed into that short span. "She came out from Kansas after I bought this place. We built it together." He gestured around the cabin. "She planted the garden out back, made the curtains, put her touch on everything." "She must have been remarkable," Delia observed, "to leave Kansas and start fresh in such remote country." "She was," Preston agreed, feeling the familiar ache in his chest, but somehow less crushing than before. "Stubborn as they come. Probably why she held on as long as she did with the illness." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them before Preston spoke again. "We were going to have a family," he admitted, voicing aloud what he'd told no one else. "Tried for years. Never happened. Sarah thought maybe this spring." He trailed off, unable to continue. Delia's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, her empathy evident but not overwhelming. "Life can be unutterably cruel sometimes," she said softly, "giving us glimpses of what might be, then snatching them away." "You sound like you speak from experience," Preston observed. She nodded slowly. "Different circumstances, but yes. I was engaged once in Philadelphia. Edward was a teacher at the boys' academy. We had plans a small house, a shared life teaching. Then he received an offer to teach at a prestigious school in Boston. He asked me to come with him, but without a marriage first." Her expression hardened slightly. "When I refused to compromise my principles, he left anyway. I later heard he married the headmaster's daughter within 6 months. His loss," Preston said with unexpected vehemence. A smile touched Delia's lips. "That's kind of you to say. But it worked out as it should. I might never have found the courage to come west otherwise." Morning brought clear skies and temperatures warm enough to begin melting the snow in earnest. After breakfast, Preston hitched Thunder to the sleigh he rarely used, preparing to take Delia back to town. "I could repair your wagon and bring it later," he offered as they stood in the yard. "That's generous, but not necessary," she replied. "Mr. Abernathy has a handyman who can retrieve it once the roads are better cleared." Preston nodded, an awkward silence falling between them. For 5 days, they had shared a home and meals, fallen into domestic rhythms that felt surprisingly natural. Now they would return to being what they truly were, strangers connected by a chance encounter during a storm. The journey to Silverstone took nearly 2 hours, the sleigh moving slowly through partially cleared roads. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts as the landscape of white fields and distant mountains scrolled past. When the town's buildings came into view, Preston felt an unexpected reluctance to reach their destination. "You can let me off at the general store," Delia said as they entered the town proper. "I live in the rooms above it." A few townspeople were out clearing walkways, and heads turned with undisguised curiosity as Preston's sleigh passed. He pulled up before Abernathy's general merchandise, bringing Thunder to a halt. Delia gathered her few belongings and the now empty soup pot. Preston stepped down to help her from the sleigh, acutely aware of the eyes watching them. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Quinn," she said formally, loud enough for any listeners to hear. "I'm grateful you were willing to shelter a stranger during the storm." "It was no trouble, Miss Morgan," he replied with equal formality. Their eyes met, and Preston saw in hers the same regret he felt that their easy companionship had to end this way, with stiff politeness for the benefit of onlookers. "Perhaps you'll stop by the store when you're next in town," she added. "Mr. Abernathy offers credit to ranchers with good standing." It was an olive branch, a way for him to see her again without raising eyebrows. Preston nodded. "I'll keep that in mind." He watched as she entered the store, greeted immediately by an elderly man who must be Abernathy himself, already questioning her with animated gestures. Then Preston turned the sleigh around and headed back toward his ranch, the town and its judgments falling away behind him. The cabin felt emptier than ever when he returned. The fire had died down to embers, and the silence pressed in from all sides. Yet there were traces of Delia everywhere: the neatly organized pantry, the swept floors, the lingering scent of the herbs she'd used in cooking. Preston moved through the rooms restlessly, finally stopping before the bedroom door. He hadn't entered it since showing Delia inside that first night, had merely retrieved clothes when needed without fully crossing the threshold. Now, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The bed was neatly made, the quilt Sarah had pieced together smoothed carefully over the mattress. On the small table beside it sat a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. Preston picked it up with suddenly unsteady hands. "Preston," it read in neat handwriting, "thank you for sharing your home and your story with me. Grief is a long road with no shortcuts, but it need not be traveled entirely alone. Should you ever wish for company on the journey, you know where to find me. Respectfully, Delia." Preston read the note twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in his shirt pocket. He looked around the room that had been his and Sarah's, seeing it clearly for the first time in months. It was just a room now: 4 walls, a bed, a bureau, a window facing east. The ghost of Sarah no longer seemed to occupy every corner. 2 weeks passed before Preston made the journey to Silverstone again. He told himself it was necessity that finally drove him there, the supplies he genuinely needed, not the woman who had left a note and a lingering presence in his home. He bathed thoroughly before leaving, trimmed his beard, and wore his least worn shirt beneath his heavy coat. Abernathy's general merchandise was busy when he arrived, several women examining bolts of fabric while a young cowhand waited at the counter. Preston removed his hat as he entered, scanning the store until he spotted Delia near the back, helping an elderly woman select from different types of tea. She looked up at the sound of the bell above the door, and their eyes met across the crowded space. Her professional smile transformed into something warmer, more genuine, before she returned her attention to her customer. Preston browsed the shelves, selecting the items from the list Delia had made during her stay: salt, baking soda, coffee, and several other necessities. By the time he approached the counter, she had finished with the elderly woman and stood ready to assist him. "Mr. Quinn," she greeted him, her tone friendly but proper. "What brings you to town today?" "Supplies," he answered, setting his selections on the counter. "Running low on some essentials." "Of course," she nodded, beginning to tally his purchases. There was no one else in the store now, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "How is your ranch faring after the storm?" "Well enough," he replied. "Lost a section of fence on the north side, but nothing that can't be repaired come spring." "That's good to hear." Their conversation remained on safe, impersonal topics as she wrapped his purchases in brown paper and tallied the total. Only when he paid and she handed him his change did her fingers briefly brush against his, a touch that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. "Will you be staying in town for supper, Mr. Quinn?" she asked, her voice lower now. "Hannah's Cafe does an excellent stew on Thursdays." Preston hesitated only briefly. "I had planned to eat before heading back." "Hannah's is just down the street," Delia said. "I finish here at 5 o'clock. It was an invitation, subtle enough to deny if he wished to, clear enough to accept if he dared. Preston found himself nodding. "I'll stop by there then." Hannah's Cafe was indeed just down the street, a modest establishment with checkered tablecloths and the promised excellent stew. Preston secured a table near the back and ordered coffee while he waited, ignoring the curious glances from other diners who rarely saw the reclusive widower in town. At precisely 5:15, the cafe door opened and Delia entered, now wearing a blue dress that complemented her eyes better than the practical brown she wore for work. She spotted him immediately and made her way to his table with confident steps. "I'm glad you decided to stay," she said as she took the seat opposite him. "So am I," Preston replied honestly. Conversation flowed more easily than he'd expected, picking up almost where they'd left off at his cabin. Delia shared news of the town the Wilkinsons had recovered from their ague. Mrs. Harrington was still trying to marry off her son to any eligible woman, and Dr. Fredericks had taken on another assistant to help with his growing practice. "He's asked me to train her," Delia explained. "Which means I may be making more trips out to the surrounding farms and ranches as she learns to manage the office." The possibility hung between them that her duties might legitimately bring her to Quinn Ranch again, a reason that would satisfy curious minds. "The Wilkinsons aren't the only ones who get sick," Preston said carefully. "Might be worth checking on more remote homesteads, too." Delia's smile told him she understood his meaning perfectly. "I'll mention that to Dr. Fredericks." As they finished their meal, Preston found himself reluctant to end the evening. "Would you allow me to walk you home?" he asked. "I'd like that," she replied. The streets of Silverstone were quiet in the early evening darkness, most businesses closed or closing for the night. They walked slowly, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, close enough that their arms occasionally brushed. "I found your note," Preston said as they neared the general store. "I hoped you would," Delia responded. "I meant what I wrote." They stopped before the side entrance that led to her rooms above the store. Preston turned to face her, suddenly uncertain what to say or do. In the soft glow of the street lamp, Delia's expression was both patient and gently expectant. "I've been alone a long time," he said finally. "Even before Sarah died. We were growing apart near the end, though neither of us wanted to admit it." "That happens sometimes," Delia acknowledged. "It doesn't diminish what you had." "No," Preston agreed, "but it makes moving forward a little less." He searched for the right word. "Treasonous," Delia suggested. "Yes," he nodded, grateful for her understanding. "Moving forward isn't forgetting, Preston," she said softly. "It's simply living." He reached out then, tentatively taking her gloved hand in his. "I'm not sure I remember how." "Perhaps we could figure it out together," she offered. Slowly. Preston felt something shift inside him, not the closing of a door on the past, but the opening of a window to possibilities he'd thought forever lost. "I'd like that," he said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "Perhaps you could bring soup to my ranch again sometime. Intentionally this time." Delia laughed, the sound bright in the cold night air. "I think that could be arranged, though preferably without the broken wagon wheel and blizzard." "Preferably," he agreed with a smile of his own. As Preston drove his sleigh back to the ranch that night, the stars brilliant overhead in the clear sky, he felt lighter than he had in months. The road ahead was uncertain, the journey of grief not yet complete, but for the first time since Sarah's death, he found himself looking forward rather than back. True to her word, Delia began making regular visits to Quinn Ranch in her capacity as Dr. Frederick's assistant. The first time was with the doctor himself, checking on a family 2 miles beyond Preston's property. The second was alone, ostensibly to deliver medicines to that same family, but stopping at Preston's on both the outward and return journeys. Each visit brought a new brightness to the cabin: fresh baked goods, books she thought he might enjoy, stories of town life that kept him connected to the wider world. Preston found himself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that both surprised and sometimes troubled him. "Am I dishonoring Sarah's memory?" he asked Delia one evening in late January as they sat before the fire. A light snow fell outside, nothing like the blizzard that had first brought her to his door, but enough to justify her staying for supper before returning to town. "By enjoying my company," she asked directly. By enjoying anything, he admitted. By feeling happy sometimes. Delia considered this thoughtfully. Do you think Sarah would want you to be miserable for the rest of your life? No, Preston said without hesitation. She'd have scolded me for wallowing as long as I did. Then there's your answer, Delia replied simply. Honoring someone's memory isn't about perpetual mourning. It's about living in a way that would make them proud. February brought warmer days interspersed with the last storms of winter. Preston began preparations for spring calving and the work of repairing fences damaged during the harsh weather. He hired 2 ranch hands to help, breaking his self-imposed isolation out of necessity. Delia's visits continued, now openly social rather than under the pretense of medical duties. The town buzzed with speculation, but Preston found he cared less than he might have expected. There was a freedom in having already faced the worst life, could offer the opinions of gossips held little power by comparison. Mrs. Harrington says you're corrupting me, Delia informed him with amusement during one visit, as she helped him plant the vegetable garden Sarah had always tended. Apparently, respectable women don't visit bachelor ranchers unchaperoned. Are you concerned about your reputation? Preston asked, pausing in his work to study her face. I'm concerned about respect, she corrected, pressing seeds into the freshly turned earth. But not reputation for its own sake. There's a difference. And do you feel respected? Here with me. The question held more weight than its simple words suggested. Delia met his gaze steadily. More than I have anywhere else. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily since that first shared bowl of soup during the blizzard. Preston reached across the garden row and took her hand, soil-stained fingers entwining with hers. I care for you, Delia, he said simply. More than I thought possible. I care for you too, she replied, her voice soft but certain. The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, a beginning rather than a culmination. Preston felt something crack open inside him, a dam of emotion he'd held back for too long. When they parted, Delia's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I never expected this, she confessed. When my wagon wheel broke that day, I was only thinking of finding shelter. Life has strange ways of giving us what we need, Preston replied, surprising himself with the sentiment. Not always what we want, but what we need. As spring fully established itself across the Montana landscape, Preston and Delia's courtship became official. He called on her in town, taking her to church services and social gatherings where they weathered the curious stares and whispered comments with unified dignity. Dr. Fredericks proved an unexpected ally, speaking highly of them both and effectively silencing the worst of the gossips. Mr. Abernathy beamed with grandfatherly pride whenever Preston entered the store, treating him as if he'd personally arranged the match. You've brought that young man back to life, the elderly shopkeeper told Delia one day when he thought Preston couldn't hear. I remember how he was after Sarah died, like a ghost himself. Now there's purpose in his step again. We've helped each other, Delia corrected gently. That's what companions do. By early summer, Preston found the courage to ask the question that had been on his mind for weeks. They were riding together on the northern edge of his property, the mountains dramatic against the blue sky, wildflowers painting the meadows in bursts of color. This land has always felt big to me, he said as they stopped to rest the horses near a small stream. Too big for one person. It's a beautiful piece of country, Delia agreed, shading her eyes as she surveyed the vista before them. You've built something meaningful here. I'd like to continue building it, Preston said carefully, but not alone. Delia turned to him, her expression cautiously hopeful. What are you saying, Preston? He dismounted and came to help her down from her horse, keeping his hands at her waist even after her feet touched the ground. "I'm saying I love you," he told her, the words emerging with surprising ease. "And I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, sharing this land, this life. It won't always be easy, but I promise to—" "Yes," she interrupted, her eyes bright with joy. "Yes, I'll marry you." Preston's heart soared as he pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Are you certain?" he asked. "You'd be leaving town life, taking on a ranch wife's burdens." "I've never been more certain of anything," Delia assured him. "The town has been a stopping place, not a home. This," she gestured to the land around them and then placed her hand over his heart, "this feels like home." They were married in August, a simple ceremony in the small church in Silverstone. Dr. Fredericks gave the bride away, and Mr. Abernathy wept openly from the front pew. Even Mrs. Harrington attended, her disapproval softened by the undeniable happiness radiating from the couple. Preston had worried the ghost of Sarah might intrude on the day, but he found instead a sense of peaceful transition. The gold band he placed on Delia's finger symbolized not a replacement of what was lost, but the creation of something new and equally precious. Their return to the ranch as husband and wife marked another beginning. Delia brought her books, her medical supplies, and her independent spirit to join Preston's quiet strength and renewed purpose. Together, they expanded the garden, added a room to the cabin, and discussed plans for the future with growing excitement. "I've been thinking," Delia said one evening in late autumn as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "about the eastern section of the property, near the creek." "What about it?" Preston asked, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. "It might make a good spot for a small schoolhouse," she suggested. "There are at least 7 children within riding distance who aren't getting proper education because town is too far." Preston considered this, seeing the idea through her eyes, not just a building but a community center, a way to bring neighboring families together and put her teaching skills to use without leaving the ranch. "You'd want to teach again?" he asked. "Part-time, perhaps," she nodded. "In winter when ranch work is lighter. We could offer the space for Sunday gatherings too, save folks the long journey to town. Building bridges beyond our fences," Preston observed with approval. Sarah would have liked that idea. She always said ranching wasn't just about the land and animals, but about being part of something larger. Delia squeezed his hand, understanding what it meant that he could now speak of Sarah without pain overwhelming the memory. She was a wise woman. "She was," Preston agreed. "And she would have liked you, Delia. Your strength, your kindness, your soup." They shared a smile at that, the simple meal that had brought them together now a cherished part of their story. "I'll draw up plans for the schoolhouse come spring," Preston decided. "We could have it ready by next fall if we start early." Winter returned to Montana, but this time Preston Quinn's cabin stood warm and welcoming against the cold. The pantry was well stocked, the woodpile high, and most importantly, the rooms filled with conversation and laughter rather than silence and grief. When the first major snowstorm hit in December, almost exactly a year after the blizzard that had brought Delia to his door, they sat together before the fire, a quilt wrapped around them both. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Delia asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "If my wagon wheel hadn't broken that day, if you hadn't opened your door to a stranger." "I try not to dwell on might-have-beens," Preston replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "But I'm grateful every day for that broken wheel." Outside, the wind howled across the plains, carrying snow that blanketed the world in pristine white. Inside, Preston and Delia Quinn built plans and dreams that would see them through this winter, and many more to come, a future neither had imagined possible a year before, born from courage, compassion, and a pot of soup that arrived exactly when it was needed most. Spring arrived early the following year, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings that seemed especially fitting. As the last patches of snow melted away, revealing tender green shoots beneath, Delia confirmed what Preston had begun to suspect: they would welcome a child of their own by late autumn. "Are you happy?" she asked somewhat anxiously as she shared the news, knowing how deeply he had wanted this with Sarah. Preston gathered her in his arms, his joy uncontained. "Beyond words," he assured her. "Beyond measure." As they stood together on the porch of the home they now truly shared, looking out over the ranch that was flourishing under their combined care, Preston reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of grief to the heights of unexpected joy, from isolation to connection, from a harsh winter storm to the warm promise of spring, life on the frontier would never be easy, but facing it together made even the hardest challenges bearable. The schoolhouse they had planned was already taking shape near the creek, ranch hands and neighboring families joining forces to raise the walls that would soon echo with children's voices. "What are you thinking about?" Delia asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Preston smiled, drawing her closer. "About soup," he said simply, "and storms, and how sometimes what looks like the end is really just the beginning." Delia laughed, the sound merging with the chorus of spring birdsong that filled the air around them. "Then here's to beginnings," she said, standing on tiptoe to kiss him as the Montana sun bathed them both in golden light.